The applause started before Naomi even finished her sentence, which told me everything about how this room worked. 300 people in the Vane atrium, glass walls stacked 11 stories into a Chicago sky the color of wet slate, and every one of them was clapping for a tower that did not exist yet, built from lines that were not hers, presented in a voice she had practiced in front of my bathroom mirror for a week without knowing I was watching from the hallway. "The Astor Spire," she said, and touched the projection like she was blessing it, "reimagines vertical density as a living organism. Every terrace breathes. Every floor plate learns from the one below it." That was my line, word for word. I had written it in the margin of a notebook 11 months ago in a life that had already ended once, and was, as far as anyone else in that room knew, only just beginning. I sat in the 4th row in a blazer that cost less than Naomi's shoes, and I smiled the way you smile at a funeral when you already know the will is in your favor. Beside me, empty seats. Behind me, the low murmur of junior associates already refreshing their Slack channels to gossip about the golden Vane girl and her miracle building. And at the head table, 3 seats from the CEO, a man in a charcoal suit who had not clapped, who had not smiled, who was watching Naomi's mouth move with the flat, patient attention of someone counting the seconds until a lie ran out of road. His name was Julian Cross. In 11 months, he would put a ring on my finger in an apartment that smelled like rain through an open window. Today, to everyone else in that room, he was only the outside auditor the client had insisted on. Some compliance formality nobody important enough to email directly. Naomi had shaken his hand at the mixer 2 weeks ago and forgotten his name by the elevator, the way she forgot the names of everyone she didn't need anything from. She had no idea he chaired the very committee that would decide, in 6 weeks, whether the Astor Spire belonged to the woman standing under those lights or to the woman sitting quietly in row 4 with a folder in her lap, thick enough to end a career. I let her keep talking. Naomi had always been better at talking than at building, which was, in the end, the entire shape of what had happened between us. She had a gift for occupying a room, and I had a gift for making the thing the room was gathered to look at. And for most of our lives, nobody important had bothered to notice the difference. I watched her hand hover over the projection like a woman warming herself at a fire she hadn't split the wood for. And I thought about the last time I'd sat in an audience and watched her take something of mine. A different room, a different life. A version of me who hadn't yet learned that silence is not the same thing as grace. I let her keep talking. I had waited a lifetime and died once to sit still for 6 more weeks. 6 weeks is nothing when you have already survived the version of this story where nobody was counting the minutes on your behalf. I should tell you what it cost the first time, so you understand why I was smiling instead of screaming. I grew up in the Vane house the way a guest towel grows up in someone else's linen closet. Present, useful, never quite belonging. My mother died when I was 7. My father remarried a woman named Carol Vane 2 years later, a woman with a daughter my exact age and a smile that photographed beautifully and meant nothing. Naomi and I were raised as sisters. We shared a bathroom, a birthday month, a bunk bed until we were 12. We were not raised as equals. Carol had a gift for a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that never raises its voice. If Naomi and I both brought home drawings, mine got a nod and hers got a spot on the refrigerator. If we both auditioned for the school play, I got the understudy and a comment about how understudying builds character. By the time we were 16, I had stopped bringing anything home to show anyone. I kept my sketchbooks in a shoebox under a loose floorboard, which should have told me something about how this life was going to go. That I learned to hide my best work from my own family before I learned to drive. Design school I did on my own money, my own loans, my own back. Naomi went where Carol's connection center, which happened to be Kessler Vane. No relation by blood. A coincidence of surname that Carol treated as destiny, and that got Naomi through doors that should have needed a portfolio. I got hired there 2 years later, on my own merit, in a portfolio review where the panel didn't know my last name matched a partner's stepdaughter until after they'd already said yes. I found that out afterward, and it was the first time in my adult life I'd felt something like clean pride. It didn't last. Naomi was a project manager with good instincts for who to stand next to in photographs. I was a designer with a habit of staying past midnight because the lines wouldn't leave me alone until they were right. We were put on the same team 11 months before the Astor Spire pitch, ostensibly because leadership thought the sisters made a nice narrative for the client deck. I should have said no. I have had a long time to sit with all the ways I should have said no. The design was mine. Every terrace, every load calculation, every insistence that a 100-story tower could function like a forest instead of a filing cabinet. Mine, built over 4 months of nights, shown to Naomi first because old habits die slower than people do, because some small idiot part of me still wanted a sister more than I wanted safety. She looked at my renderings over my shoulder in the office kitchen and said, "Wow, this could actually be something," in a voice with a doorway already opening behind it. 3 weeks later, she presented it to the partners as a collaborative concept she'd been developing with the team. My name mentioned once, generously, as if I'd fetched her coffee while she thought. 3 weeks after that, in a private meeting I wasn't invited to, she presented it again with my name gone entirely. By the time the client fell in love with the Astor Spire, it had her signature on every file, time-stamped and versioned and clean, because Naomi Vane had learned exactly one genuinely impressive skill in her life, which was how to erase a person from a paper trail without leaving fingerprints. When I objected, quietly, in a manager's office with printouts of my own drafts and dates that predated hers by months, I was told with real sympathy that sibling disputes over collaborative work were hard to adjudicate, and that perhaps I should consider whether ambition was souring something that used to be a beautiful relationship between sisters. Carol called me that night to say the same thing in gentler words and a harder tone. My father, on the extension, said nothing at all, which was the answer he always gave when a decision might cost him a Christmas. 3 months after that, I was let go for leaking proprietary concept work to a competing firm, a charge built on an email I never sent, forwarded from an account with my name on it that I hadn't logged into in a year. I found out much later that Naomi had the password because I'd typed it in front of her once, years earlier. Laughing, trusting, 17 years old, and certain that trust was the normal condition between people who'd grown up in the same house. The man I was engaged to at the time, Marcus, a contracts lawyer with a jaw like a recruitment poster, took 2 days to decide he believed the firm's version of events over mine, because the firm's version came with fewer complications for his own career, since his managing partner played golf with Naomi's mother. He gave me back the ring in a coffee shop, apologetically, like he was returning a sweater that didn't fit. There are smaller cruelties I remember more clearly than the big ones. The way you sometimes remember the smell of a room better than the argument that happened in it. I remember Naomi borrowing my portfolio this summer before design school interviews, just to get a sense of what good work looked like, and returning it 3 weeks later with 2 pages missing. The 2 pages I later saw, nearly unchanged, inside her own application. I remember Carol hosting a dinner the week I made the dean's list and spending the entire toast talking about how proud she was of Naomi's growth this semester. A semester in which Naomi had, as far as I could tell, grown nothing but a tan. I remember learning, slowly and then all at once, the way you learn a language by immersion, that in that house affection was a resource with a fixed supply, and that every unit of it spent on me was one Carol seemed to feel she couldn't spend on her actual daughter, so she simply declined to spend it at all. I want to say I fought back earlier. I didn't. I was the kind of child who decided very young that being good and quiet and useful was a survivable strategy, and I carried that strategy into adulthood the way you carry an old coat, doesn't fit anymore, but can't quite throw away, because throwing it away means admitting how cold you've been the whole time you were wearing it. I brought Naomi coffee on late nights. I covered her shifts when she was hungover. I told myself every single time she took a little more than she'd earned that this was just how sisters were. That keeping the peace was its own kind of love that surely, eventually being endlessly reasonable would be recognized and rewarded. It never was. That is, I think, the actual lesson underneath everything that happened to me, the one I had to die to learn properly. Some people do not experience your patience as a gift. They experience it as a resource. And resources, once discovered, get used until they run out. The Astor Spire was simply the largest thing I had ever let her use. After the firing, the fabricated email, the proprietary concept leak that existed nowhere, except in a folder Naomi had access to and I did not, I spent 4 months applying to every design firm within 300 miles and heard nothing back from firms that should have been fighting over a portfolio like mine. It took me embarrassingly long to understand why, because I still believed, foolishly, that the industry ran on merit instead of phone calls. I found out by accident from a junior recruiter who'd had one drink too many at an industry happy hour and let slip that someone at Vane had made a few calls, described me as difficult, dishonest, a liability risk, language specific enough that I recognized Carol's exact turn of phrase from a dozen family arguments before I ever recognized it as a professional death sentence. I remember the apartment I moved into after I could no longer afford the one Marcus and I had picked out together. A studio above a laundromat that smelled permanently of fabric softener and drain water, with a radiator that clanked all night like something trying to get out. I remember taking the print shop job because it was the only place that didn't run a background check that would flag the firing. And I remember standing at the industrial cutter at 2 a.m, thinking, with a strange, distant clarity, that I had spent my whole life making things beautiful for other people and had somehow ended up here, cutting other people's wedding invitations, unable to afford my own. I will not walk you through all of it. The blacklisting, the freelance jobs that dried up once certain phone calls got made, the 18 months of temp work, and instant noodles. And a body that stopped sleeping properly somewhere around month 4, the way exhaustion stops feeling like exhaustion after a while and starts feeling like a permanent weather system you've simply learned to live under. I will only tell you that I was crossing Wabash at 11 at night, coming back from a shift at a print shop that paid me in cash because nobody would put me on payroll, and that I was so tired, so completely and finally tired, that I did not see the delivery truck running the yellow the way I would have seen it a year earlier, when I still had reflexes that belonged to someone with something left to live for. I remember the headlights. I remember thinking, with a strange and total calm, that's Naomi's color of yellow, the exact shade of the dress she wore to accept the Vane Legacy Award for a building I designed. And then I remember waking up in my childhood bedroom, 24 years old again. Sunlight coming through curtains Carol had picked out in a decorating phase, 8 years gone. My sketchbook, the real one, the hidden one, still safe under the floorboard where I'd left it a lifetime ago. For a long time, I did not move. I lay on my back and stared at a water stain on the ceiling I remembered perfectly. A stain shaped a little like a rabbit that used to comfort me as a child, and now felt like proof of something too large to name. And I cataloged the small details the way you check your own pulse after a fall. The specific creak of the third stair, audible even through a closed door. The smell of Carol's lavender detergent drifting up from the laundry room. The particular gray Chicago light of a March morning I had lived through once already, and apparently was now being asked to live through again. I got up eventually and found my student ID in the desk drawer where I remembered leaving it. Expiration date still years off. My face in the photo younger than I currently felt in any way that mattered. I did not scream. I did not cry, not at first, though the crying came later that day. Quietly in the shower, not from grief exactly, but from something closer to relief so large it had nowhere else to go. I lay very still that first hour, and I thought, with the clarity of someone who has already paid the most expensive tuition there is, I know exactly how this story goes if I let it. And then, slower, colder, better. So I won't let it go that way twice. What surprised me most in those first days was not the impossibility of it. I never once seriously entertained the idea that I was dreaming or dying or losing my mind in some final fever behind a real hospital bed somewhere. I simply accepted it the way you accept weather because arguing with it changed nothing, and every hour spent arguing was an hour I could otherwise have spent preparing. What surprised me was how quickly the planning started to feel like breathing. How naturally, after only a few days, my grief reorganized itself into inventory. Passwords to change eventually, but not yet. Not until the timing served me. Conversations to avoid repeating verbatim so nothing in this life would feel too neatly rehearsed to anyone paying close attention. A professor's name and office hours, still years in my future, that I wrote on an index card and taped inside a book so I wouldn't forget it before it mattered. I did not know that first week about an auditor named Julian Cross. That knowledge was still 14 months away in the life I remembered, an ember I hadn't yet learned I was carrying. I only knew with total and unshakable certainty that whatever this second chance turned out to cost me, I intended to spend every ounce of it building proof instead of hoping for mercy. The gift I came back with was not magic. Not exactly. I did not float or glow or speak to ghosts. What I had was worse for Naomi and better for me. I had already lived the next 4 years. I knew which files she would copy and when. I knew which manager would look the other way and which one would look the other way for a price. I knew the name of the account she'd hack, the password I'd been foolish enough to say out loud in front of her, the exact shade of yellow she'd wear to accept an award built on my bones. And I knew one more thing. A small thing. The kind of detail that only mattered because I happened to remember it at all. I knew that in my old life, I met Julian Cross 14 months after the Astor Spire disaster. At a mutual friend's dinner party, both of us newly single and cautiously kind to each other in the way of people who've recently been handled roughly by the world. I knew that we fell in love slowly and married at 30. I knew that he was, in that old life, already an independent compliance auditor with a reputation for being incorruptible to the point of social awkwardness, the kind of man clients hired specifically because he could not be charmed, flattered, or intimidated into signing off on something rotten. And I knew that the International Design Standards Board, the body every major firm submitted major concept work to for provenance certification, the quiet bureaucratic machine that decided on paper who legally owned an idea when 2 people claimed it, rotated its audit committee chairs every 2 years, and that Julian had chaired it once already in the years I remembered and would very likely chair it again on a schedule that happened to fall precisely across the Astor Spire's certification window, because I had, in my old, useless, dead life, once made him laugh by asking about his job at that dinner party, and he had told me, almost shyly, that he was up for the chair again next cycle. A throwaway sentence, a nothing. The kind of detail a woman in love commits to memory without meaning to. The way you remember what song was playing. I did not know this life's Julian yet. I did not know if he would like me, if the timeline would bend the same way twice, if love was a fixed point in whatever strange loop I was standing in, or just a lucky accident I couldn't count on twice. But I knew where he'd be. I knew what he valued. And I knew, and because I had watched him once refuse to sign off on a client's fraudulent seismic report even after they threatened to sink his firm's contract, that Julian Cross could not be bought, could not be charmed, and could not be stopped once he had decided a piece of paper was lying to him. So I did the only sensible thing a woman who has already died once for being too honest can do. I decided to be patient. I decided to build a second file behind my first one, a shadow copy of every drawing, every draft, every late night, backed up somewhere Naomi would never think to look because Naomi had never once in her life imagined that I might be smarter than she needed me to be. And I decided this time to walk into Julian Cross's orbit long before Naomi ever learned his name. Not to manipulate him, God. Not that I am not proud of many things, but I am proud that I never once lied to that man, but simply to exist near him, honestly as myself, so that whatever happened later, he would already know exactly who I was before anyone tried to convince him otherwise. I met him at a rooftop industry mixer 11 weeks into my second chance on a Thursday I remembered clearly because in my old life, I had skipped it to work late on renderings that would end up with someone else's name on them. This time I went. I wore the green dress instead of the black one because in my old life, I'd worn black to everything for 2 years, running like I was in permanent mourning for a future I hadn't lost yet. And I decided that if I was getting a second run at this life, I would at least wear the color that made me feel like a person instead of a placeholder. He was standing near the drinks table doing the thing I would come to know as entirely characteristic of him, which was reading the fine print on a sponsor banner instead of talking to anyone. Because apparently even at parties, Julian Cross could not stop himself from checking whether a claim was accurate. I liked him immediately for exactly that reason. That's a made-up statistic, I said, nodding at the banner which claimed the sponsoring firm had reduced material waste by an industry-leading 340%. A number that is not merely wrong, but structurally impossible. He turned, and I watched something in his face brighten in a way I recognized, even though I'd never seen it happen to me before in this life. It's not just made up, he said. It's made up wrong. You can't reduce anything by more than 100%. It would have to generate negative waste. Anti-waste. A waste vacuum. Maybe that's the innovation, I said. Waste vacuums. Put it on the next slide. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing important and everything that mattered. What made a building honest, whether efficiency and beauty were actually in tension, or just lazily assumed to be, why he'd left a lucrative in-house counsel role to do independent audits that paid less and made him unpopular at every firm he touched. Because somebody has to be willing to be the person who says no, he told me, turning his glass slowly, not performing the line, just meaning it. Most people can be talked out of their own eyes. I've never been able to manage that trick. My mother used to say it like it was a character flaw. It's not, I said, with more feeling than the conversation strictly called for. And he looked at me a beat too long, like he'd heard the weight under the sentence without knowing where it came from. Marcus existed in this life too, at the edges of it, a name that surfaced once at an industry gala where he was working the room for a different law firm entirely, in a different orbit than the one that had once nearly become my marriage. I saw him across the room and felt nothing sharper than the mild, distant recognition you feel, spotting a stranger who resembles someone from a dream. In my old life, I had loved him the way you love a life raft. Gratefully, uncritically, because the water was cold and he was the nearest solid thing. In this one, I had never needed a life raft badly enough to mistake it for love. And when he caught my eye and lifted his glass in polite, empty greeting, I understood, with a clean and almost funny clarity, that I had already outgrown an entire relationship without ever having to have it. Some ghosts you don't need to exorcise. You just need to arrive somewhere they were never invited. I did not tell him my last name that night. Not out of strategy, or not only out of strategy, but because for the first time since I was 17 years old, I wanted 1 hour of being liked for a reason that had nothing to do with the Vane family at all. When he finally asked near the end of the night, I told him, and watched his face do the small, polite recalibration people's faces always did at that surname. The flicker of, oh, one of those Vanes. And I said, before he could decide anything, stepdaughter. Not blood, and not the one you'll read about in the trade press, if you keep reading the trade press. I don't read the trade press, he said. I read filings. Even better, I said. Read mine someday. Not hers. He didn't ask what I meant. He filed it away, the way he filed everything away, in that terrifyingly organized brain of his. And 3 weeks later, at a different function, he found me at the edge of a room and said, I looked up the Vane portfolio submissions from the last industry showcase. There's a load-bearing concept sketch credited to N. Vane that has, if I'm reading the metadata right, an earlier draft floating around with different initials. Oh, he watched my face very carefully while he said it, giving me every chance to lie, to deflect, to say it was nothing. Those are my initials, I said. It happens more than you'd think in my family. He didn't say anything else about it that night. But he asked me to dinner the following week, and I understood, watching him hold the door, that Julian Cross had already started keeping his own file on the truth quietly, the way he kept every file, long before I ever asked him to. Dinner turned into a standing Thursday. Thursdays turned into a key to his apartment that I didn't ask for and he didn't offer with any ceremony. Just left on the counter one week like it had always been there. He was not an easy man to love exactly. He forgot to eat when he was deep in a filing. He corrected people's grammar in group texts. He once spent 40 minutes explaining to me, unprompted, the specific structural failures in a bridge collapse from 1981 because a documentary had mentioned it in passing. But he was an honest one entirely, all the way down, in a way I had never once in my first life been permitted to take for granted. When I told him small true things about myself, he believed them. When I told him small doubts about my own family, he didn't try to smooth them over or suggest I was being sensitive. He just nodded, filed it, and asked better questions the next time. Your stepmother sounds like someone who keeps a ledger, he said once, months in, after I'd told him, carefully testing the water, about the refrigerator drawings and the missing portfolio pages. Not a metaphorical one, an actual one. People who withhold affection strategically are usually doing math somewhere, even if they'd never call it that. That's a very Julian way to describe my childhood, I said. I contain very few other ways, he said, entirely serious. And I laughed so hard I had to put my wine down, and he looked pleased with himself in the small, quiet way he had, like he'd solved something. I did not in those months tell him about the life I remembered. I want to be honest about that too. It was not a secret I kept out of strategy alone. Some nights I lay awake next to him and turned the whole impossible shape of it over in my head and simply could not find a sentence that wouldn't sound like the opening line of a breakdown. I died once and now I'm back. And I already know the order things are going to happen in. There is no dinner table voice for that sentence. So instead, I did the only honest thing available to me. I built the proof instead of the confession. I let the paper trail say what I could not yet say out loud, and told myself that someday, once the proof had already done its work, the confession would be easier, because by then, it would sound less like madness and more like an explanation for a plan he'd already watched succeed. At work, meanwhile, I was rebuilding something I'd lost the first time without ever quite noticing I'd lost it. Allies. In my old life, I had been too proud, or too tired, or too used to solitude to let anyone else get close enough to see what was happening to me until it was already over. This time, I made a point of it. I became, deliberately and without performance, a decent colleague, the kind who remembered a junior architect's kid's name, who covered a shift without making it a transaction, who said thank you to the interns doing thankless renderings work. It cost me nothing, and it built me something I badly needed: witnesses. Priya Nair, a structural engineer 2 cubicles down with a laugh like a trumpet and zero tolerance for corporate nonsense, became the closest thing to a real sister I'd had in either life. She was the one who first noticed, months before the theft even happened, that Naomi had a habit of reviewing other people's files a little too thoroughly. She did the same thing to Devin last year, Priya told me over lunch, low-voiced, the office cafeteria roaring around us. Took his HVS integration idea, called it a joint concept, got the bonus. He quit 2 months later. Nobody talks about it because nobody wants to be the person who accused a Vane of anything. She looked at me carefully. You know that, right? That you're basically dating a landmine every time you show her a sketch? I know, I said, and meant it more completely than Priya could have understood. Then why do you keep showing her things? I didn't answer right away. And Priya, to her enormous credit, didn't press. She just watched me for a moment with the particular unimpressed patience of an engineer who has learned that people usually get around to the load-bearing truth. Eventually, if you don't rush the scaffolding, and then she changed the subject to something about a contractor who'd poured a footing 4 inches off spec, and I loved her a little right then for knowing exactly how much of me to ask for and how much to let stay private. Over the following months, I told her more than I told almost anyone. Not the impossible parts, never those, but the ordinary human shape of the danger, that Naomi had a documented history, that I was building a paper trail rather than a confrontation, that when the moment came, I would need people in the room who owed Naomi nothing and had actually witnessed something true. I didn't ask her to be that person. I never once asked. I simply let her see enough of what was happening that she arrived at the decision to become one entirely on her own, the way real allies always do, the way no one in my first life had ever been given the chance to, because in my first life I'd been too afraid of looking paranoid to let anyone close enough to notice the pattern before it was already over. I didn't have an answer I could give her yet. What I had instead was a growing folder on an external drive Priya didn't know existed, backed up in triplicate, notarized in pieces over months so no single filing would look like the sudden defensive maneuver of someone who already knew what was coming. I built it the way you build a levee before a flood the Weather Service hasn't announced yet. Quietly, methodically, and without explaining to the neighbors why you were bothering, because explaining would have meant admitting I already knew the exact date and height of the water. There was one night in February that nearly unraveled the whole careful architecture of it. Naomi came into the office at 8 in the evening, unannounced, while I was working late on the terrace ecology load calculations, and stood behind my chair a beat too long, watching the screen. "You're really deep in this one," she said, in a voice pitched somewhere between admiration and appraisal. The same tone Carol used when she was deciding whether something of mine was worth taking credit for. "Are you sharing this with the team yet?" "Not yet," I said, closing the laptop with a casualness I did not feel, my heart going hard and fast in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "Still rough. I don't like showing rough work." She looked at me for a moment too long, and I thought, with a jolt of old fear she remembers. Some animal part of her recognizes this room, this exact conversation, from a version of events that technically hasn't happened yet, but it passed. The way most of Naomi's suspicions passed because Naomi had never once, in either of my lives, considered the possibility that I might be operating on information she didn't have. She smiled, said something about how she couldn't wait to see it when it's ready, and left. And I sat alone in the dark office afterward with my hands shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the sheer physical strangeness of standing that close to the hinge of my own life and watching it swing the way I needed it to swing. There was a smaller theft first, months before the Aster Spire. One I let happen entirely on purpose because I needed, for my own sake as much as any strategy, to see whether this Naomi was truly the same Naomi or whether some different arrangement of circumstance in this second life had made her into someone capable of change. In January, she'd asked to see a modest facade renovation I'd sketched for a boutique client. A small commission, low stakes, the kind of project nobody would ever build a lawsuit around. I showed her. 2 weeks later, she presented an almost identical concept to a different client entirely, in a meeting I wasn't invited to, describing it as something she'd been playing with on the side. When I heard about it secondhand from Priya, I felt the old furious grief try to rise, and underneath it, colder and more useful, a kind of confirmation I didn't enjoy receiving but needed all the same. No, she had not changed. Some people are not villains because of what happened to them. They are simply consistently all the way down who they have always been, and no number of second chances you hand them will do the work of becoming for them. I said nothing about the facade concept. I let it go, deliberately, the way you let a smaller fish swim past so the net stays hidden for the fish that actually matters. It cost me a project I genuinely liked, and a small private ache I never mentioned to anyone. And it bought me the one thing I needed more than credit for a boutique storefront: certainty. When the Aster Spire sketches went under the floorboard of my laptop bag, that spring, instead of into a shared drive Naomi could quietly access, it was not out of paranoia. It was out of research, conducted patiently, at my own expense, against a hypothesis I already knew the answer to and tested anyway, because I had learned the hard way that knowing a thing and having proof of it were not the same currency, and only one of them could be spent in a hearing room. Naomi, meanwhile, was doing exactly what I remembered her doing, on almost exactly the schedule I remembered, because people rarely improve when nobody's forced them to. She leaned over my shoulder in the office kitchen on a Tuesday in April. The same Tuesday, the same kitchen, the same coffee going cold in her hand, and looked at my renderings for the Aster Spire and said, "Wow, this could actually be something." And I felt the old flinch try to rise in my chest, and I let it pass through me like weather. It could, I agreed, and smiled, and did not close the laptop, and did not this time feel like a fool for showing her. Because this time the sketchbook under the floorboard held 4 extra months of drafts she didn't know existed. Dated and witnessed, and as of 2 weeks earlier, quietly filed with a patent attorney I'd hired with money I'd been saving since the day I woke up in my old bedroom, knowing exactly which bills to pay off early and which stocks to avoid. The weeks between that kitchen conversation and the formal unveiling were the longest of my second life, longer even than the 6 weeks of the audit that came after, because during the audit I at least had proof already sealed and waiting. During those spring weeks I had only patience. And patience, it turns out, is a muscle that burns the same, whether you're using it for good reasons or bad ones. I watched Naomi's collaborative concept grow a life of its own inside the firm, watched 3 separate senior partners praise its ambition in 3 separate meetings I wasn't invited to, watched the client's excitement build from a polite nod to a genuine, contagious enthusiasm that infected the whole building, the kind of energy that makes people start talking about a project in the hallway like it's already a landmark instead of a set of drawings. Every one of those conversations was, in its own small way, a paper cut, and I collected them the way I'd once collected Carol's slights, quietly, precisely, filed away where nobody could see me keeping score. There was a Friday, 3 weeks before the unveiling, when Naomi asked me to help clean up the technical documentation on the terrace load calculations since, as she put it, "You're just better at the math side of things than I am." I sat with her for 2 hours that afternoon, walking her through my own structural logic slowly enough that she could take notes, watching her write down formulas I had derived, at 2 in the morning, 11 months prior in a life she didn't remember and would never believe in, and I found to my own surprise that I felt almost nothing at all. Not rage, not grief, just a distant clinical patience, the way a surgeon must feel, watching a wound she already knows exactly how to close. When she thanked me afterward, genuinely, warmly, the way she always thanked me right before taking something, I said, "Of course, that's what sisters are for," and watched her miss the edge in it completely. Because Naomi had never once, in either of my lives, been equipped to hear an edge in my voice. She had spent her whole life assuming my voice didn't have edges at all. I want to be honest about the ugliest part of this because I think you deserve honesty even in a story about revenge. I let her steal it. I did it on purpose. I showed her more than she needed to see, left files open a little longer than necessary, mentioned in the break room, apparently to no one, that I was thinking of taking the Astor Spire concept to a boutique firm across town who'd shown interest in poaching me. A lie, but a useful one because within 4 days, Naomi had collaboratively developed the entire concept into a formal proposal with her name as lead, moving faster and more carelessly than she ever had in the life I remembered. Because this time, she was racing a threat that didn't actually exist, and panic makes even careful liars sloppy. I sat in every meeting where she took credit. I nodded when the partners praised her instincts. I said nothing when my own name was mentioned once, in passing, as someone who'd helped execute some of the technical elements. I went home every one of those nights and cried exactly as much as I needed to and not one tear more, because I had already grieved this particular betrayal once in a body that no longer existed, and grief you've already paid for in full does not get to charge you twice. What I did instead, every night, was build the shadow file. Time-stamped drafts. A signed and notarized statement from a former professor who remembered reviewing an early version of the terrace ecology concept in my grad thesis 2 years before Naomi had ever heard the word biomimicry, a quiet, deniable, entirely legal record of every version, every date, every place my fingerprints touched that design before hers ever did. And 6 weeks before the Astor Spire's formal unveiling, I did the one thing I remembered doing wrong the first time and refused to do wrong again. I submitted my own original files, sealed and dated, directly to the International Design Standards Board's provisional registry under my own name, through a process so unglamorous and administrative that Naomi, who had never once in her life read the fine print on anything and didn't even know it existed, I knew because I had lived long enough in a future that no longer needed to happen, that the board's audit committee reviewed every registry submission against any subsequent public claim of authorship as a matter of routine fraud prevention. I knew that if Naomi's firm submitted the Astor Spire for the industry's biggest design commendation, the Vane Legacy Award, ironically enough, named for the very family currently robbing me blind, the certifying audit would cross-reference the registry automatically. And I knew, from a rooftop mixer 11 weeks into this borrowed life and 100 careful conversations since, exactly whose signature would be at the bottom of that audit. The morning of the unveiling, the one I told you about at the start, the atrium, the applause, Naomi's hand resting on my stolen tower like she'd built it out of her own ribs. I woke up next to Julian for the first time in this life as something more than a woman he was cautiously falling for. He'd proposed the week before in his own understated, over-prepared way in the same apartment kitchen where he'd once left a spare key on the counter without ceremony, with a ring he'd clearly researched for months. A plain band, no stone, because he'd asked me once in passing what I thought of diamonds, and I'd said something offhand about conflict minerals and traceability, and he had apparently filed that answer away for 11 months, and built an entire jewelry decision around it, the way he built everything, on evidence instead of assumption. He had a speech prepared, too, index cards and everything, which he pulled out of his jacket pocket with the stiff formality of a man presenting a legal brief, read the first 2 lines of, and then stopped, visibly frustrated with himself, and set the cards down on the counter. I had a whole argument outlined, he said. Premises, structure, a conclusion. I've been rehearsing it in the car for a week. He looked at me, and something in his face went uncharacteristically unguarded. the flat, careful auditor's expression cracking open into something much younger and much more afraid. I don't want to keep finding out who you are one file at a time. I want the whole record. All of it. Now, please. Which was for Julian Cross the single most romantic sentence he was constitutionally capable of producing, unpolished and slightly panicked and entirely, devastatingly sincere. And it made me laugh and cry at the same time in a way I hadn't done since before I died the first time. I said yes. I did not tell him that morning that I already knew what his committee assignment for the fall cycle was going to be, because I genuinely didn't. Not for certain, not this time around, since I'd changed enough small things that I no longer trusted the future to run on rails. I only knew what I'd built and what I hoped, and that hope, this time, felt like a plan instead of a prayer. He mentioned it himself over coffee 3 days before the unveiling, entirely unprompted, the way the universe sometimes rewards patience with a coincidence so clean, it feels like justice deciding to show its work. I got the audit committee chair for the fall cycle, he said, distracted, scrolling through his morning briefing. Design standards board. Should be routine. Big showcase piece coming through registry review. Some tower thing your sister's firm is submitting for the Legacy Award. He looked up, caught something in my face I hadn't managed to smooth away in time. What? Nothing, I said, and meant for the first time in either of my lives, everything. The unveiling in the atrium was theater, and everyone in that room except me and I suspected Julian believed the play was already over. Naomi walked the board through the Astor Spire's terraces like a woman unveiling her own child. And in a way I understood that too, because for 4 months those terraces had felt like mine to raise as well, before she'd taken the crib and called it a nursery she'd built herself. I let her have her afternoon. Applause is cheap. What isn't cheap is a board audit that takes 6 weeks, cross-references 3 separate registries, and ends in a hearing room instead of a press release. Those 6 weeks between the unveiling and the hearing were, I think, the strangest of either of my lives, because for the first time I was not living inside a memory I already possessed. I had run out of future to remember. Everything from that atrium morning forward was new country, and I found that terrifying in a way the theft itself had never quite managed to be, because at least the theft had come with a map. Julian moved his things back to his old apartment on a Sunday, quietly, without making it a production, folding shirts into a duffel bag while I sat on the edge of our bed and told him I understood, even though understanding and liking were 2 entirely different rooms and I was only comfortably furnishing one of them. It's 6 weeks, he said. I know it's 6 weeks too many. I need it to be unimpeachable. Not just true, unimpeachable. Those aren't the same thing, and I need this to be both because I already know what people are going to want to say about it once it's over. What are they going to want to say? That the chair fell in love with one claimant and buried the other, he said, without flinching, in the flat, honest way that made it impossible to be angry with him, even when I badly wanted somewhere to put my fear. I won't give them the sentence. I'd rather sleep on my own mattress for 6 weeks than hand them the sentence. I did not see him once during that stretch, not really. A handful of accidental crossings at industry events where we nodded at each other like polite strangers. One excruciating afternoon at a mutual friend's engagement party where we ended up on opposite sides of the same room all evening, both of us aware of the other's location at all times the way you're aware of a held breath. I filled the empty nights with Priya, with long runs along the lake that did nothing for my actual anxiety and everything for my ability to fall asleep afterward. And with the quiet, obsessive work of triple-checking every document in my file until I could recite the timestamps in my sleep. What I did not know, and what I only learned much later in pieces, the way you learn most of the interesting parts of someone else's diligence, was that Julian had spent those 6 weeks running an investigation far more thorough than the board technically required. He'd pulled the metadata on every file Naomi's team had touched going back 14 months. He'd requested and received the full server access logs from Vane's IT department over the visible discomfort of 2 partners who clearly hadn't expected an outside auditor to actually use his subpoena power instead of rubber stamping a showcase piece the way showcase pieces usually got rubber stamped. He'd found, buried 9 folders deep in a shared drive nobody thought to scrub properly, an earlier draft of the April collaborative concept meeting minutes with a track changes history showing 3 separate edits made after the meeting had supposedly already concluded. Edits that added my name in one version and quietly removed it in the next. The digital equivalent of a hand caught halfway into someone else's pocket. He told me once, months after the hearing, that the hardest part of those 6 weeks hadn't been the workload. It had been sitting across from Priya Nair in a formal deposition interview, watching her describe overhearing Naomi's exact words through a half-open door and understanding immediately that this piece of testimony would matter enormously, and having to ask himself, honestly, brutally, whether he was believing her because it was true or because it made the case he already wanted to win. I made her repeat the timeline 4 times, he told me. Different order each time. Looking for the seam where a rehearsed story falls apart. It never fell apart. That's when I knew I could actually use it instead of just wanting to. That was Julian in full. A man who would rather doubt the evidence that helped the woman he loved than risk building a verdict out of hope instead of proof. I understood, hearing it, exactly why I had loved him in a life I no longer remembered living beside him, and exactly why some things really were fixed points no matter how many times you rearranged everything around them. That hearing came on a Tuesday in October, held not in the glittering atrium but in a conference room on the board's 14th floor that had all the theatrical grandeur of a DMV, which felt honestly like poetic justice all its own. Naomi arrived in a suit that cost more than my first year's rent, flanked by 2 Vane partners and a lawyer who kept checking his watch like this was a formality he was billing for the pleasure of finishing early. I arrived with my own lawyer, my sealed registry documentation, and a calm I had spent a lifetime and a death earning. Julian sat at the head of the committee table, 3 other auditors flanking him, and did not look at me once during the opening statements because he was, above all things I had ever loved about him, relentlessly fair, and he had recused himself from any private conversation about the case for the entire 6 weeks, had in fact moved out of our shared apartment into his old place for the duration, sleeping on a mattress he still owned for exactly this reason, because he would rather lose 6 weeks of nights beside me than let anyone credibly claim he'd tipped a single scale. "The registry," he said, when it was his turn, in the flat, unhurried voice I'd fallen in love with over a made-up statistic on a sponsor banner, shows a provisional filing dated 11 months prior to the public unveiling, under the name Wren Callahan, containing structural, aesthetic, and ecological concept documentation, matching approximately 94% of the submitted Astor Spire proposal. The public submission, filed under Naomi Vane, contains no prior registry entry, no notarized development history predating the internal April meeting minutes, and he paused, the only pause he allowed himself in the entire hearing, and looked directly at Naomi for the first time, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. An access log showing the Callahan file was opened from Ms. Vane's credentials on the same Tuesday referenced in those meeting minutes, 4 hours before the so-called collaborative concept was first drafted. I watched something collapse behind Naomi's eyes in real time, the exact moment the floor she'd been standing on her whole life. The floor built out of other people's silence, other people's love, other people's unwillingness to make a scene finally gave out beneath her. She looked at me. I did not look away. I'd spent a lifetime looking away from Naomi Vane, softening my face so she'd feel comfortable enough to keep loving me a little, and I found in that DMV quiet conference room that I had absolutely nothing left to soften. "This is a mistake," she said, too loud for the room, the first crack in a voice that had never once had to defend itself before an audience that wasn't already on her side. Wren showed me those files. She wanted my help. She wanted... "The registry is time-stamped by a third-party federal system," Julian said. "Still not unkind, still terribly permanently fair, and cannot be edited retroactively by either party. I'd encourage counsel to review the technical appendix before continuing that line of argument." Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. "You don't understand what she's like," Naomi said. And I felt the old script trying to run. The sympathetic tilt of the partners' heads, the reflexive institutional flinch toward protecting the golden daughter of a partner's family. And I watched it fail to land, watched it bounce off a room built entirely of people whose job was to read documents instead of feelings. "Ms. Vane," Julian said, not unkindly, "the committee is not adjudicating character. We're adjudicating a timeline. If you have documentation predating the registry filing, this is the moment to submit it. She didn't have it. That was the thing about Naomi that I had spent 2 lifetimes learning and only fully understood in that room. She had never once needed documentation because she had never once needed to convince anyone of anything. People had simply always believed her, on sight, the way rooms believe a person who has never had to work for belief. She had no muscle for proof because she had never had to build one. Her lawyer requested a recess. Julian granted 15 minutes, professional and unbothered, and I sat very still in my chair while Naomi's team huddled in the hallway outside the glass, their voices a low, urgent hum I couldn't hear and didn't need to. When they came back, the lawyer tried a different angle entirely, one I recognized because I had rehearsed against it for months in my head. He suggested that the registry filing itself might have been fraudulently backdated, that the notarized professor's statement might have been coerced, that this was, in fact, an elaborate long con on my part rather than hers. That's a serious allegation, Julian said. Do you have evidence to support it, or are we speculating? The lawyer did not have evidence. Priya did, though nobody had asked her to bring it, because Priya Nair had spent the last 6 weeks quietly, furiously compiling her own account of that February night in the office. The date, the time, the conversation she'd overheard through the half-open door on her way to grab a forgotten badge, Naomi's exact words about wanting to see it when it's ready. She hadn't told me she was doing it. She stood up from the small gallery of witnesses at the back of the room, unasked, and said, "I can speak to the timeline if it's useful." And Julian, visibly recalibrating his afternoon, said that it was. Priya's account took 11 minutes and did more damage to Naomi's case than my entire binder of registry documents combined, because it was the one piece of testimony in the room that came from someone with nothing to gain and no reason to lie. Someone who had simply seen what she'd seen and decided, quietly and on her own initiative, that she wasn't going to let a colleague get erased twice. When she sat back down, she caught my eye across the room and gave me the smallest nod, the kind 2 people exchange when they both know exactly what just happened and have decided not to make a show of it. There was one more exhibit, small and almost forgotten, that I hadn't planned to need and was glad in the end to have anyway. The professor's notarized statement, delivered not in person but by video recording, since he'd since retired to a coastline too far to travel from on short notice. He was an old man by then, gray and unhurried on the screen, describing a graduate thesis review from years earlier with the mild, unbothered precision of someone who had reviewed 1,000 student projects and remembered this one specifically because of how carefully I'd worked out the ecological logic of stacked terraces functioning as a single respiring system. "It's not a common approach," he said, squinting slightly at whatever notes he'd kept, which is exactly why I remember whose idea it was. Naomi's lawyer objected to the relevance of decade-old academic work. Julian overruled the objection in a single flat sentence, noting for the record that provenance predating a disputed claim was, in fact, the entire subject of the hearing, and the objection did not survive a second attempt. I did not speak much myself in the end. I had built the case to speak without me, on purpose, because I remembered too well what it felt like to stand in a room defending my own honesty and watch that defense get treated as evidence of guilt. The desperate, the innocent, don't need to explain themselves logic that had cost me everything the first time. This time, I let the paper do what paper does. I let the dates argue. I let the access logs argue. I sat with my hands folded and let 6 weeks of patient, unglamorous documentation do the one thing Naomi had never once had to learn how to do for herself. The board's ruling took 11 minutes to deliver and considerably longer to fully sink in for the people it ruined. The Astor Spire's authorship was formally attributed to me. The submitted entry was disqualified from Legacy Award consideration due to what the ruling politely termed material misrepresentation of provenance. Kessler Vane's compliance department was referred for internal review regarding the falsified April meeting minutes. And Naomi Vane, specifically, was flagged in the board's registry for a 5-year submission ban, a professional scarlet letter that would follow her onto every project she ever tried to file again. I wish I could tell you Carol called to apologize. She didn't. She called to ask in a voice gone thin and strange whether I intended to let this destroy the family. as though the family had been something other than destroyed the moment she'd decided, 20 years ago, that one daughter's comfort was worth more than the other's truth. I told her gently because I found I had room for gentleness now that I no longer needed a war to win it. That the family had made its choice a long time before I made mine. And that I hoped she and Naomi found some peace, somewhere else, without me in the audience for it. My father said nothing, as he always had, which I understood now was its own kind of answer, and one I no longer needed him to change. Naomi called me once, 3 weeks after the ruling, late at night, from a number I almost didn't recognize because she'd never once in either lifetime called me after 9 o'clock. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did in the end. Not because it changed anything, but because I think I needed to hear, out loud, that some doors really were as closed as I'd decided they were. "You planned this," she said, without hello, without preamble, her voice raw in a way I genuinely never heard it before. "Don't tell me you didn't. The registry filing, that professor, Priya, God, even Priya. You built all of that before I ever touched your files. You let me." I thought about lying. I thought about softening it. The old reflex rising up out of some deep muscle memory I hadn't fully unlearned. The part of me that still, after everything, wanted to make this easier for her. I didn't. "I did," I said. "I let you take exactly enough rope to hang the whole thing on. You've been doing this since we were 14, and taking things that weren't yours because nobody in that house ever once told you there'd be a bill. I decided it was time somebody sent you the bill." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost the fight in it, gone thin and almost young. "I don't even know why I do it," she said. "I don't even want the things. I wanted to be the one who got looked at like that. Just once. The way they looked at you when you didn't even know they were looking." It was, I think, the most honest sentence Naomi Vane had ever said to me in either of my lives, and it did not undo one single thing between us, and I told her so, as kindly as I could manage. "I hope you figure out how to earn that someday," I said. "I can't be the place you take it from anymore." And then I hung up, and I did not cry, and I did not feel triumphant either. Only tired in the clean, finished way you feel after setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had a weight at all. Naomi's fiance, a hedge fund associate named Preston, who had proposed to her the same month she'd stolen my tower, presumably impressed by the same glow of borrowed brilliance that had fooled everyone else, read the board's public ruling online 3 days after the hearing, the way most of the industry did, and called off the engagement over text, a detail I did not learn until months later and did not, I confess, feel 1 ounce of guilt about. Kessler Vane let her go quietly the following week, citing restructuring, the same bland institutional euphemism that had once been used to erase me. The last I heard of her secondhand, through an industry newsletter neither of us would admit to reading, she'd taken a junior role at a firm 2 tiers down from where she'd started, rebuilding a career from the bottom the way the rest of us had always had to, the way she'd simply never once been required to before. Naomi's fiance, a hedge fund associate named Preston, who had proposed to her the same month she'd stolen my tower, presumably impressed by the same glow of borrowed brilliance that had fooled everyone else, read the board's public ruling online 3 days after the hearing, the way most of the industry did, and called off the engagement over text, a detail I did not learn until months later and did not, I confess, feel 1 ounce of guilt about. Kessler Vane let her go quietly the following week, citing restructuring, the same bland institutional euphemism that had once been used to erase me. I kept my job. I kept my name, the whole record of it, filed and sealed and unimpeachable. I kept the Astor Spire, which broke ground the following spring under my own name, on drawings that had always been mine, in a lobby that would one day hold a plaque nobody could ever quietly replace. The groundbreaking was a small, unglamorous affair compared to the atrium unveiling that had started this whole second life of mine. A rented backhoe, a few dozen people in hard hats, a client representative who shook my hand like she was genuinely relieved to finally be dealing with the person who'd actually drawn the thing. Priya stood beside me the whole ceremony, arms crossed, grinning like she'd personally poured the foundation. Carol did not come. I had not expected her to and found, standing in a muddy lot in a hard hat 2 sizes too big, that I did not mind the absence nearly as much as I once would have. 2 years later, I stood in the finished lobby at the tower's public opening, looking up through 11 stories of terraces that breathed exactly the way I'd once promised a room full of people they would, back when the promise still belonged to someone else's mouth. The plaque by the entrance read exactly what it should have read the first time. Astor Spire. Principal Design. Wren Callahan. I stood in front of it longer than was probably normal for the building's actual architect, running my thumb over the raised letters of my own name, and thought about a woman crossing Wabash at 11 at night who never got to see a single leaf of any of it grow. And I kept Julian, who married me on a rooftop not unlike the one where we'd met in a green dress, under a sky doing its best impression of the one from that first night, and who told me in his vows in the flattest and most sincere voice I have ever heard a man use for the word love, that he had never once in his career signed his name to a lie and did not intend to start with the two of us. I did not tell him that day everything about how I'd known where to find him, how I'd known which committee, which cycle, which quiet administrative door to walk through 11 months before anyone else even knew it existed. Some things a person earns the right to hear slowly over the whole rest of a life instead of all at once on a wedding day. But I promised myself, watching him slide the ring onto my finger under that borrowed sky, that I would tell him everything. Eventually, every version of it, every year I'd already lived and lost and been given back. I had died once for being too trusting, too quiet, too willing to let the people who were supposed to love me decide how much of myself I was allowed to keep. I did not die that way twice. I built a record instead, patient and sealed and true, and let the people who never once believed I was capable of outsmarting them find that out from a man who could not be talked out of his own eyes. In a room with no atrium, no applause, and no room left at all for anyone's comfortable lies. Sometimes, still, I catch myself flinching at small things that shouldn't hurt anymore. A coffee left too long on a counter, a certain shade of yellow passing on the street, the particular pitch of a woman's laugh in a crowded elevator. I don't think that flinch ever fully leaves a person, whatever life they're living. What's different now is what comes after it. In my first life, the flinch was the whole story. It was where I lived permanently, a woman braced for a blow that had already landed and would always be landing. In this one, the flinch passes through me in a second or two, and then it's just Julian's hand finding mine without either of us deciding to reach, or Priya laughing too loud in the next room, or a plaque on a lobby wall with my actual name on it, catching the light exactly the way I always knew it would, if anyone had only ever bothered to let it.